right, so good afternoon, and let me start by expressing my gratitude to Professor Aviad Klimberg for inviting me to be part of this annual interdisciplinary workshop. And I thank the School of Historical Society Studies as well for being hosts. Secondly, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Iridbach for the hospitality. We've had a good conversation this afternoon. Let me also thank Elia for all the correspondence. Yes, and for ensuring that I don't miss my way here. Yeah. So thank you. Yes, when I was invited to contribute to the conversation on the theme, contextualizing the self, creating and recreating the first person, which is a kind of a continuous workshop, I thought perhaps one way is to provide some kind of theoretical reflection, but also link that with my own work on Africa, but also on the African diaspora. So what I decided I was going to do is to spend part of the presentation looking more into theoretical questions, and then towards the end I can link that up with my specific case study. Okay, so I thought this screen was going to come on, but let's see. All right, so here you've got my presentation roadmap, and I will start by way of introducing how I understand the whole dynamics of contextualizing the self. I think it's very important in trying to contextualize the self to problematize Africa, because I think this is part of the issue in trying to link that the question of the self. So I would look at Africa, what I call the problem of definition and the definition of a problem, and then try to link that with what I consider to be the paradoxes of the continent, but also the historiography of Africans' invention and reinvention, which helps me, therefore, to better contextualize the self, raising questions of identity and the whole enigma of identity. And then, finally, I would try to tease out the complexities of the African religious landscape and how individuals, but also community, relate in that sense. And if I have time, I can talk about the whole dynamics of ethnicization of the new African diaspora, but I see how things go. So, by way of introduction, I have found very useful the special issue of the journal Contemporary Social Science, which had a special issue on contextualizing the self in contemporary social science. And this special issue for me was interesting because it provides a variety of perspectives on current thinking of the nature of the self within a socio-cultural context. And this is what helps me to relate that to Africa, for instance. And in this special issue, it brings out the paradoxical stance of self, especially looking at how it is both autonomous but also interdependent. At the same time, how it is reflexively open, socially embedded, and interactively created. So this special issue is particularly illuminating because it provides the self as a relational and not a metaphysical or essential entity. So I find it useful to play around with how this special issue captured this. For instance, I take one or two articles in this special issue. Zacharias summarizes various developments in current social science thought, which explore the dynamic, relational, and non-linear understanding of the self. And I think this article I find very interesting because according to Zacharias, that involves the consideration of the complex links between agents and structures. And so this whole dynamic dialectic between agents and structure becomes one way of trying to contextualize self as a non-linear entity. This article was also thinking about the critical interrogation of these links, starting from an agent-based systems perspective, and highlights the contextual and dialectic emergence of the self in contemporary society. And I think this article was very successful in providing a fresh interdisciplinary framework for understanding the complex dynamics of both the self and the society, which has practical implications. So the way I'm going to argue this is to look at, the self and society, to look at Africa and individuals, and how there's a kind of a mutual mirroring of the self in this case. Then I give you a second example. The article by Jeff Vass, I would argue, provides a new framework of the social self, exploring selfhood and its pragmatic coherence in the context of what he calls social entropy. This article was also very illuminating for me, especially because it examines the rise of what he calls entropic views of sociality and the established selfhood, and discusses the central difficulty traditional frameworks that are based on two broad paradigms of understanding selfhood have for indexing the stability of the self as a register for social change. And in this article, Jeff argues that any contemporary approach to the construction of the self must be able to deal with the prevailing context of the entropy of the social and its impact on the self. So I take these two examples from this special issue just to show how this can help us in further deconstructing the self in relation to the other. Okay, let me move from this example and then situate my own talk here. So what I'm trying to do in my presentation is to attempt to contextualize the self within the socio-cultural ambience and religious imaginaries of sub-Saharan Africa, and in this way trying to show how it's fluid but also paradoxical as both autonomous and interdependent. And to be more specific, I'll be drawing concrete examples from indigenous religious worldviews and African Christianity in a way to demonstrate how and to what extent the relationality of the self is an important dynamic for constructing but also negotiating identity and belonging. So this is what I'll try to show at the end of my presentation. So, contextualizing the self and the other. I think there's no denying the fact that Africa is witnessing an increasing impact of globalization on self and identity. But at the same time, there's a growing uncertainty. And this uncertainty plays out both politically, economically, socially, culturally, but also religiously. This experience of uncertainty, I would argue, motivates individuals, groups, but also nation-states to find local niches for identity, construction and reconstruction, but also negotiation and renegotiation. So to make it a bit more concrete, perhaps we could explore self and identity on 3 levels. On the individual level, on the local level, but also on the global level. But not as separate entities, but to look at the interface of these 3 levels, the individual, but also the local and global. And I would like to suggest, therefore, that each of these levels, each of these 3 levels, is characterized by self and social reception and recognition, or self and societal denial of identity, but also what I would like to call a kind of a jaundiced or a convoluted or precarious identity that emerges in the interplay between recognition and denial of identity at the same time. And I will try to show this in my presentation. Having said that, I think it's been argued that we might perhaps need a dialogical conceptualization of self and identity in which global and local voices are constantly involved in interchanges and negotiations. And so in this case, I see a very close relationship between localization and globalization, but also the increasing voices and counter voices that play out within these 2 spaces. We can pay attention to the role of social power, but also to the role of emotions. And much more concretely, looking at the contextualization of the self and social change raises questions about stability, safety, and security. And I think the reaction, the response to issues of safety, stability, and security has very important questions, to both the construction and negotiation of identity, in a way that there could be, on the one hand, self-affirmation, but there could also be self-denial. And perhaps there's even a 3rd level of marginality that plays out very concretely. Also in this regard, I think about contextualizing the self, again, with regards to identity. And I think one issue that is very important in this negotiation is whether through this negotiation individuals think about or construct high self-esteem or low self-esteem. And I think the construction of high or low self-esteem has something to do with both the recognition and denial of identity. And I'm not suggesting that these are fixed, There's a kind of fluidity in this regard. And one example, perhaps, is to think about contextualizing the self and the Ubuntu philosophy, which talks about the whole idea of I am because we are. So an individual is not just an island of itself. An individual makes sense in terms of the community. An individual does not exist on its own, but exists for and in and on behalf of the community. In other words, there's not a unilinear perspective, but there's an interaction. There's an intricate relationship between the individual and the community that he or she belongs. And it is within this framework that the whole discourse about the contextualization of the self or issues about identity is negotiated. So, I took this illustration because I thought it might help us see this kind of relationship, the looking glass self. And here is an individual and other 4 individuals who perceive this individual in different ways that might be similar but also different from how the individual contextualizes the self. First, how my mom and dad see me is different from how my girlfriend sees me. It's different from how my elder brother sees me. But it's also different from how my ex-girlfriend sees me. And each of these perceptions are not exclusive. So they are kind of interactive, you know. So in other words, this drawing depicts the looking glass self. The person at the front of the image is looking into 4 mirrors, each of which reflects someone else's image of himself. And sometimes the way that people perceive us can shape the way we perceive ourselves. In other words, self-perception sometimes is shaped by public perception. And so I want to use this example to look at the way Africa has been perceived and constructed, but also see how Africans respond to this kind of perception. I'm not sure how correct that is, that mirrors show us what we look like, not who we are. Well, we can come back to that debate. I'm not quite convinced about that, but maybe you tell me. All right, so let me try and maybe illustrate this looking at Africa as an entity and see how Africa has been constructed and perceived, and then try to see how Africans perceive of themselves, you know, whether this makes a lot of sense. And that raises the question of African identity. What is Africa? And one scholar has described Africa as a jigsaw puzzle comprising 55 countries, thousands of ethnic groups, and arbitrary boundaries that were inherited from the colonial period. And so, up till date, the continent is still struggling to contextualize the self. It's still trying to understand this labeling. What does it mean? Is it an artificial construction, or is it a construction that is real? And Ali Mazure, in one of his writings, The African Condition, was grappling with how to deal with the many problems that Africa confronts today. And he says that Africa must find ways to transcend the conflict-ridden heritage of Europe. And I think I like Cornell's quote here, which I think is very interesting in trying to understand African identity. And I will quote him here. Quote, "It is unclear how and to what extent African identity can be changed, recovered, or reformulated. Neither is it possible to rid it of non-African traits. The process of identity retrieval may be more or less radical, more intellectual and physiological than physical, etc. It concerns the African worldview, mindset, spirituality, and the whole of African culture. It seems that the strongest motive behind the wish to recover African identity is the urge to rid Africa of its negative self-image, mindset of dependency, its poverty, and underdevelopment." So, on the one hand, we think about how Africa was constructed and who constructed Africa. And then on the other hand, we see the problems that this construction may have created. And then we see the third level, how Africans themselves are relating to this construction, but also to deal with the problems, the consequences of this artificial construction. And so I use that as to kind of help me understand the contextualization of the self, because the contextualization of the self is not isolated enterprise. It's an enterprise that is linked to understanding the self, but the self in relation to the wider society. And this is the argument I'm trying to make here. And Pobe has argued that poverty has become a very macabre facet for African identity. And in many regards, the public image about Africa is a continent that is poor and is all crisis-ridden. Wars and HIV and AIDS and so on. So this is the public image that needs to be redeemed by Africans. But if identity is never static, but always historically, geographically, and sociologically conditioned, hence contingent, what is the point of looking for and identifying with historical roots? If the question simply is that there was an Africa that was better before Europe messed it up, you know. Because that is one argument, that things looks, there were not all this chaos, you know, in the continent until the artificial, you know, division of Africa into spheres of colonial exploitation, you know. So how can we redeem? Is there an ideal identity before then that we can redeem? Or is it just a waste of time? Is it possible to retrieve a former identity? Is it possible to determine what African identity was before colonialism? Was there even Africa as an entity before colonialism? I think these are larger questions. However, the notion of personal identity, which entails personality, religious, linguistic, behavioral, and sexual attributes, cannot be separated from the national and ethnic identity, and represents an even more important aspect of identity than the latter. So what I'm trying to argue is that the identity of the continent cannot be disentangled from national and ethnic identities. And it is in this regard that we can think about self-identity within this framework. Okay, so this is the 55 or more countries that make up the continent. And of course, there's always a tendency to think that Africa is very uniform, is very homogeneous, which is very problematic, because Southern Africa is very different from Eastern Africa. Eastern Africa is very different from Northern Africa, and Northern Africa very different from West. So it raises questions about this construction. So it leads me to the next point very quickly, the problem of definition and the definition of a problem. There is an inherent artificiality and complexity with regards to the term Africa in a way that makes it sometimes very ineffective as an identifying construct because of these complexities that I've mentioned. So the challenges of defining Africa, I would argue, affects how we identify and analyze African identities, ethnicities, cultures, and religions. And the term invention has become rather ubiquitous in African studies since Mudimbe's renowned book, The Invention of Africa. And so the idea of Africa is thus a complex one with multiple genealogies and meanings, notions that tend to swing between the poles of essentialism and contingency. And Paul Zeleza points out that there has been at least 7 origins of the term Africa. All narratives about how the term African came about, 7 have been identified, but all of these 7 narratives were foreign. So in other words, no African community or groups or individuals contributed to the formation of the term Africa. And I think this is the contradiction. And so what do we do with it? What do we do? How do we contextualize the self within a continent that actually has foreign derivation. And then the contradictions that comes from the continent, how do Africans interrogate these contradictions, especially against the backdrop of, first of all, accepting this construct, but also not just accepting the construct, but understanding it. Not just understanding it, but doing something with it. And I think these are different levels that we can think about. So far less clear is when the appropriation of Africa as a self-defining identity occurred in the various regions and among the different societies. So in a sense, according to Zeleza, Africa is as much a reality as it is a construct, you know. And you can see his quote there. Because of time, I will skip that. So at the beginning of the 21st century theory, the maps and meanings of Africa and Africanness are being reconfigured by both the processes of contemporary globalization and the projects of integration. So now, Africans have accepted that construct, and they are trying to make sense of it. But at the same time, they are trying to deal with the contradictions that come with that construct. So the subject of African identities, therefore, is as vast as the continent itself and includes perspectives such as religious, ecological, linguistic, and ethnic taxonomy. So at the end, I'm going to talk about the religious configuration just as a point of emphasis. And it was argued that the conflation of Africa with sub-Saharan Africa or Africa south of the Sahara and so on and so forth, that are so common in discourses about Africa, ultimately offers us a racialized view of Africa. Africa as biology, as the black continent. And I think that argument makes a lot of sense. Let me move on very quickly because of time to briefly carve out the historiography of Africans' reinvention. And I think two scholars stand out well here. Said on the one hand and Mudimbe. They have been depicted as whistleblowers against ideologies of otherness. And I think their works are very important here because they are both bulwarks against the exotic orientalization of Africa. And in their works, they both sought to contain the forces of otherization in North-South relationship. And I think we may be familiar with Mudimbe and Said's work here, so I won't spend much time here. But also interesting, I draw from Ali Mazrui, who has been another very visible voice in trying to unpack the historiography of Africans' reinvention. And here you see a number of quotes from one of his works. I don't think I need to read that here again because of time. But I find it very salient in trying to understand the very reinvention of Africa as a continent. Okay, so let me move on. Yes, and very interestingly, Mazrui proposes 5 phases in the history of the external conceptualization of Africa, its reinvention and reinvention. And he gave these 5 phases, which I've outlined here. Again, I won't go into that. Yes, let me skip because of time, but maybe just to make this point, and I find it very interesting what Mazrui makes, the point he makes, that it's a great irony of modern African history that it took European colonialism to inform Africans that they were Africans. And I think this is a very important point. which I see as a positive version of the invention of Africa. And according to Mazuri, quote, Europeans may not have invented the name Africa, but they did play a decisive role in applying it to the continental landmass that we recognize today. And of course, thinking again about the 1884 partition, scramble and partition of Africa, I think this just makes it very clear. Okay, now, what does this have to do with identity? And I think it's very important. One of the most serious consequences of colonial rule and racial domination are the crises of identity which they generate. And we can look at this crisis of identity both culturally, religiously, politically, and sometimes also economically. For instance, a complication arises when the colonial order implants, encourages, or even invents whole new identities, like Christian and Muslim identities, again, which are very much contested in different parts of Africa now. Not to talk about language. In many African countries, the official languages, are European languages. So you have the Anglophone, you have the Francophone, you have the Lusophone, and maybe in a smaller regard, you still have some communities that speak German. So what does this mean when in most parts of Africa, the official languages, the commercial language is foreign? I think it has implications for the whole renegotiation of identities. Okay, now gradually I want to link this with religion. And I think that there's an interplay of religion and ethnicity because these are forces operating in Africa. Much of the crisis we have and much of the problems we have beyond economic and political questions are issues around ethnicity and religion. And so what I'm trying to focus here is how these are not just problems, but how Africans are dealing with these problems of ethnicity and religion, which are also seen as legacies of the colonial system. Could you tell me how I'm going with time?
It's up to you. You have 20, 25,
okay.
half an hour.
Okay, that's great. I can. All right, so let me try and slow down a little bit. Okay. Now, I will come back to the question of religion and ethnicity. But I think it's important to come back to the question of identity, how sometimes this is complex. And we may need, therefore, to think about the hierarchy of identities. No single individual has one identity. We have multiple identities. And a scholar like Stryker suggests that one identity is of greater importance in the hierarchy of identities that make up the self. So in trying to contextualize the self, what kind of identity do we prioritize if we have multiple identities? We have cultural, we have historical, we have ethnic, we have religious, we have sexual identities. So what is most important in the hierarchy of identities? So he argues that when an individual becomes more committed to a given role, it will assume higher identity salience. So I'm going to look at African communities and see what identity sometimes is most important for them and how did they negotiate this. So The most salient identity is the one most likely to be enacted in a given situation or social relationship. And the example I would want to talk about is their religious cultural identity. But we need to pay attention to the enigma of identity in trying to look at the religious but also ethnic identities. Because identities can be invoked, used, interpreted with, displayed, performed in particular social scenes. But at the same time, identities can be actively constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed by individuals or groups in our social cosmos, in addition to being redefined, challenged, accepted, or rejected by other people, communities, and institutions. And so this has to do largely with the contextualization of the self. How does this play out on these multiple levels, especially against the backdrop that the way we conceive, the way we contextualize the self is in relation to other identities, larger identities that we are confronted with. So, for instance, the formation of a religious identity is a dynamic and ongoing process. It's not fixed, it's not static. And we will see this with the example I will give at the end. Okay, let me skip this. Okay, the last thing I will talk about in terms of the enigma of our identity is to point out Laurie Pick's attempt to make sense of identity, where she provides 3 stages of religious identity development. And in relation specifically to religion as ascribed identity, religion as chosen identity, and religion as a declared identity. And I try to relate this with how we contextualize the self. The way we contextualize the self can be related also to these 3 stages of identity. Pick challenges research that takes ethnicity as the most salient identity. Again, if we look at ethnic identity, we will see that, well, there are certain situations where, in terms of the hierarchy of identities, ethnic identity is not the most prominent. It could be religious identity. It could be national identity. It could be any other identity, depending on the situation. Okay, I gave an example with the diaspora, but let me skip this because of time. But what is very interesting in my research on African migration, I also try to see how individuals contextualize the self. And I have an image of a Kenyan couple in Scotland. They founded a church called the World Conquerors Christian Center that has branches in London and in Edinburgh. I'm just merely looking at that image. There's a discourse there. This is a contestation of identity. When you open the website of this church, this is the first image you see. And I think it says quite a lot about how we contextualize the self. Because what this image is suggesting is that, yes, we are Africans, but we are also Scottish. And I find it very illuminating in this direction. And what I try to do in my research on the African diaspora is how actually there's what I call the ethnicization of the African diaspora, where in actual fact, if you look at the UK census, Africa is treated as an ethnic group. So there's a box, if you ask to click, you see ethnicities, and one of it is Africa. And I can imagine how you can ethnicize a whole continent, you know. And this is, again, this kind of construction, you know. How do Africans respond to this kind of ethnicization of a continent that is made up of at least 2,000 ethnic groups, you know? So that is one way I try to show how sometimes the UK census undermines continental, national, but also cultural identities. I just wanted to give that example. Okay, let me go to the last part of my presentation now to tease out the complexity of African religions landscape. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the religious landscape is complex, is fluid, but it's also dynamic. In a sense, the African continent is seen as one of the religious laboratories of the world today. Whether you're thinking about Christianity or Islam or indigenous religions, but even the Eastern-related religions, you know. But even some variants of Judaism, we have several groups that self-represent themselves as African Jews. So how do we deal with this kind of complexities, especially against the backdrop of contextualizing the self, the whole dynamics of self-depiction versus the way people are represented. So we have a scenario where there is a kind of contestation and negotiation between what I call religious vendors for power, space, and identity. And here I talked about the complexity of the religious landscape, looking at the fact that the very word religion is a latecomer in the scholarly discourse about Africa. So it was only in the 1960s, from the 1950s and 60s, that there was a conscious recognition that Africans had religion. Much of literature before the 50s and 60s talk about superstition and fetishism and all kinds of very negative terms. So again, what I'm trying to suggest is that even the discourse about religion, you know, was an external discourse, which has now come to be accepted by Africans themselves. So the study of religion in Africa has its root outside the continent, just as the very category of religion itself has a European history. And this is seen actually on the level of scholarship, that actually the academic study of religions in Africa today is dominated by Western, particularly European scholars. So if you are looking for books on religion in Africa, but I also think history or geography of Africa, the books are out here, not in there. And so it takes many African scholars and students to go to Europe and America to discover books about their countries and their villages. And so this is part of the whole process of representation. And this results in political dynamics. Who gets the power to talk about Africa?
What they study in school when children go to school?
Yes, yeah.
They take history?
Okay, very interestingly, the kind of history we were taught was European history.
Really?
Yes. So the argument I'm making is that it is only recently that Africans are beginning to reconstruct and say, no, we have to study our own history, because some Western scholars said Africa had no history. It's documented that Africa has no history. So if you have no history, what are you going to study? Right. Yeah. So this is the point I'm therefore trying to make, that to contextualize the self, you need to critique the way you are perceived in a way that enables you to discover the self. And this is the argument I'm trying to make here. So in the process of scholarship, they impinged their methodologies and brought their worldviews and epistemologies to bear. And that is why, for instance, the concept religion is a construct that many African scholars and students are dealing with today, because religion is very narrow. It doesn't capture spirituality, which is a wider dynamics. Okay, let me leave the historiography, I think because of time, and think about the interface of religious cultures. Again, because we had a dominance of the European knowledge, when Christianity and Islam came, the narrative was that the indigenous religions disappeared. So there was that kind of hegemonic discourse which suggests that, yes, Christianity conquered everything, Islam conquered everywhere, and the indigenous religions disappeared. So that was the dominating narrative or discourse. But in trying to reconstruct the self, I think it's important to realize that although indigenous religions encountered colonial influence, new religious forms are leading to the revitalization in some contexts, synthesis, reinvention. Sorry, the power is out. Okay, let me. I can just go on. Okay, so the central argument is that although we have the proliferation of Christianity and Islam in many parts of Africa, there's the tendency to think that indigenous religions disappear, just in the way that it was also mirrored as if European civilization and all that came to Africa and the African civilization, African cultures disappear. This is not true. And so a better way to understand this is to see the interaction, the interaction between European cultures and African cultures, the interaction between Christianity, Islam, and the indigenous religions. And rather than think about the disappearance of indigenous religions. And so what my research has shown is that what operates is a kind of mutual impact. Indigenous religions has not disappeared. I actually argue in my work that Christianity and Islam became popular in Africa because of the indigenous religions. And that is why we need to understand today what we talk about in terms of African Christianity or African Islam. Because these two traditions became domesticated in a way that produced something that was no longer totally European Christianity or Arab Islam, but it produced something that is totally new. And so it's interesting to understand these dynamics in looking at the interface. Oh, we have it back, yeah? I didn't. Okay. The interface of, perhaps it's even easier just to speak without the slides, yeah? Okay. Yeah, so this is the argument I'm making, that we need to see how the indigenous religion continues to be dynamic.
So what's peculiar about Africa? If there is such a thing as an African, what's peculiar about African Christianity or African Islam? In what way are they different from, say, European or North American?
Yeah, interesting. I think that leads me to the next slide. What is interesting about African Christianity and African Islam needs to be seen in the way when Christianity, for instance, was introduced to African societies, it was Christianity that was largely dressed in European robes, yes, European culture, and did not make much impact until when it started to be indigenized.
When was that?
Well, particularly the first Christianity was introduced in many parts in the 18th, 19th century and did not make much impact. In actual fact, Islam made much impact in Africa than Christianity at this early stage. So it was the domestication of Christianity, the kind of Christianity that came up when the local agency, when Africans started to expand Christianity, to transmit Christianity, but also to vernacularize Christianity. That was when it started to have an impact. And particularly from the 1920s and 30s forward. And so we need to look at these new developments. But what is very interesting is that it raised a new kind of debate about whether by taking on Islam or Christianity, Africans have done away with their indigenous religions, in terms of whether it's compatible to be both African and Christian at the same time. And these were new debates that came into limelight, or to be, can you be African and be a Muslim at the same time? And what happens on the ground is that the religious sensibilities are quite important. People combine these religious traditions. In actual fact, if you look at the history, the European Christianity that was introduced, mission Christianity, condemned the indigenous cultures. And so for you to be Christian, you have to change your name, you have to dress the way I dress, because if you dress in the African attire, you are looked as very primitive. You have to change everything about you. And that was the kind of Christianity that didn't succeed until Africans took Christianity into their own hands, vernacularized it, and domesticated it. You know, taking the religious cultures very seriously. So the point I'm making here, therefore, is that the kind of religion cultures that we have today is one that, you know, integrates all these multiple facets. So the problem in Africa is not simply about, when you think about conflict, and this leads to the question of conflict, the problem in Africa is not religion, it is the politicization of religion. You take a country like Nigeria and you hear about the crisis, Boko Haram in the northern part. This doesn't suggest that Christians and Muslims don't live together. In the southern part, Christians and Muslims live together. But it's the politicization of religion that actually makes this really a problem. And that is why we have quite a lot of conflict. So what I try to show, looking at the history of religious competition, is how in the earlier part, African religions and cultures were denigrated, were not accepted, you know, as part of, as convenient and conducive for Christianity or Islam. But much later in the post-independence era, what we see on the ground is that people consciously combine religions and do not see it as any kind of contradiction.
And
so,
also,
yeah.
Can you be both Christian and Muslim, or just indigenous and Christian, indigenous?
Yeah, you have all kinds of mix, and I will give you an example at the end. So my central argument is that to be able to understand the religious landscape, we need to see the growth and transformation of indigenous religions, Islam or Christianity, in terms of mutual interaction, in terms of mutual competition, but also in terms of mutual influence, rather than in terms of the way they have developed separately. And part of this bias, for instance, I will give you this example just to close. If you look at many African societies or countries, the statistics given is almost always biased. Depending on the country that you are talking about, you might find that the statistics says, okay, if it's a Christian-dominated country, there are 90% Christians and maybe 5% Muslims, and then 1% adherent of indigenous religions. If it is a Muslim-dominated country, you might find the direct opposite, 95% Muslims, 2% Christian, and 0.5% adherents of indigenous religion. This is problematic because this is a kind of colonial missionary legacy to suggest that you don't have adherents of indigenous religion, But people creatively combine indigenous religion with Christianity and Islam, even though they would deny it. And part of the reason is because indigenous religion is not an institutionalized religion like Christianity or Islam. Okay, I think because of time, I just want to round up with these examples, just to demonstrate how complex this interface is. Today, in different parts of Africa, we have examples where Africans creatively combine religions. The first example is an Islamic group called NASFAT. NASFAT originated in Nigeria, but it's a Muslim group that meets on Sunday. They don't go to Juma service on Friday, but they meet on Sunday, the same period that Christian churches are having their programs. And so it's been called Pentecostal Islam because it's packaged like a Christian Pentecostal group. The second example will be Chrislam. Chrislam is another kind of religious tradition in Nigeria that combines Christianity and Islam. So when they meet, they have the Bible and Quran side by side, but also the indigenous religion. So they combine the three traditions at the same time. And so you have this kind of examples just to demonstrate religious sensibility of many Africans. I'm not suggesting that all Africans, Kweku Bonsan is an indigenous traditional priest in Ghana who actually claims, he goes on the media claiming that he gave power to some Pentecostal pastors. So again, it demonstrates the intersection between the indigenous religions and Christianity. So I gave these examples just to close as a way of saying that the way Africans engage and construct, or negotiate religious resources is a very complex matter. And sometimes we need to see what operates on the ground because it helps us in the way they contextualize the self in relation to other kinds of identities, both religious, both ethnic, both cultural and social identities that they are surrounded with. And I think I would like to just stop on that note and we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Questions? Yes. Just introduce yourself.
Hi, Ya'vaz-Ouniversitet from the Middle Eastern and African History Department.
Yes.
How prevalent are those groups of Islam and Islamic Pentecostal Islam, and how are they viewed by Muslim and Christian clergies?
Yeah.
And another question, in the previous slide, I think you had a sentence, conversations with taxi drivers.
All right, okay. All right, okay. That is yes, I thank you. I skipped that because it was very interesting experience. Okay, let me take thank you for your two questions. the NASFAT group has several branches in Nigeria now, and they've established branches in Europe and the United States. So it's a group that is spreading fast. How is it viewed by Muslims and Christians? Mainstream Muslims don't identify with this group. So this is a group that was established in Western Nigeria. So it's finding a lot of difficulty in spreading to Northern Nigeria. This is also because of the way Muslims from Northern Nigeria perceive Muslims from Western Nigeria. They often perceive Muslims from the West as not authentic Muslims, because they see them as mixing Islam with indigenous religions. So this is one example of those groups. But how are they perceived by Christians? Well, of course, they have also, this is again what I call religious competition. They are struggling for space. They are copying what quite a lot of Pentecostal churches do. The leader of NASFAT would preach the way a Pentecostal pastor preaches, because he wants to attract the youth. So that is one way I can respond to that. Yeah.
Does this include other aspects, speaking in tongues?
No, they won't speak in tongues, but they will organize programs like night vigil. Among Pentecostal groups, they will organize revival services, night vigils. The use of media. All these dynamics they try to take on. So that's why some have nicknamed them Pentecostal Muslims now. Of course, it's a derogatory term, but the point I'm making is that it's not just one is copying from the other. There's mutual influence. So Muslims are impacting on Christians, but vice versa. The example of the conversation with a taxi driver is an interesting one. In 1995, precisely when I went from Germany to do field work in Nigeria, I took a taxi going on my field trip, and it's usual to find bumper stickers. And in this particular taxi, there was a sticker in front, of the windscreen which says, "Jesus is the answer," which is very common.
Yes.
And
what is the question?
yeah. And then looking behind the screen, I saw another bumper sticker: "Allah is the greatest." So this is one Christianity, the other Islam. I got very inquisitive, and then I was just looking around the vehicle, and I discovered some charms under the dashboard, which represents Christianity, Islam, and the indigenous religions. So I asked the driver, "Are you a Christian?" And it's usual. It said that Nigerians answer questions they answer questions with questions.
The Jews.
Oh, the Jews also, okay. So he asked me, "Why did you ask?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm just curious, because I saw this sticker, Jesus is the answer, another Allah is the greatest, and then I see something under your steering, your dashboard." Then he laughed and said, "Yeah, actually, it's better to belong to the three, so that if one fails, the other will be correct." You can imagine that logic,
But is this typical?
It is typical. But the problem is that people deny the other. For instance, Pentecostals, Christians would not want to identify with the indigenous religions. They would demonize them. No, this is terrible, But when there are problems, they consult diviners. Muslims will do the same thing. Christians will even go to a Muslim alpha or leader, cleric, for solutions to problems. So this is the religious sensibility that we have. Of course, officially, they will not say they are involved in this. So this is what I was trying to use the example of my conversation with the taxi driver to say that quite a lot of Africans are...
Normally he'll have to be one thing, but
yeah.
in fact he's several things
yes.
at the same time.
Yes, several at the same time. But this is what I talk about, the hierarchy of identities.
Right.
So if you ask me, who are you? Are you a Christian? Adherent of the indigenous religion? I can say, oh no, I'm a Christian, because there's a social clout, yes, expectability. Oh no, it's more popular, it's more modern to say you are a Christian than to say you are an adherent of the indigenous religions. Yeah. Yes.
Please.
Hi.
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, Adogame, and I started at the University of Princeton.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the challenges of creating an African identity that comes within Africa. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think was the role of Pan-Africanist intellectuals, both from Africa and from the African diaspora, in suggesting that kind of maybe identity from the 30s maybe to the 70s? So that was one question. And
Yeah.
the other one was about movements to decolonize the universities. I know that in South Africa there have been very extreme demonstrations of students that are trying to decolonize the curricula, the university, the same kind of movement in the UK as well. And I was wondering if at Princeton you feel the same kind of student organizations calling for these kind of changes.
Okay. No, interesting. No, thanks for your question. Yes, I think they have, right from the whole prior to the independence declaration of many African societies, there has been always that call to recreate Africa, and this is partly teased out in Pan-Africanism, that came out of particularly the African diaspora, from the historical African diaspora, many who were forcefully moved to the Americas, and the whole idea to rediscover home, and of course sometimes it became just even an illusion, an imagination to discover home. So there has been this whole call and this whole movement, which much more recently led to the creation of NEPAD, or even the African Union, But sometimes why some of these fail is partly because there's always the attempt to replicate what happens elsewhere. For instance, a criticism of the African Union. Why do you need to come up with African Union? Because there's European Union. You see. So there's that contradiction. Or for instance, in Addis, why will you, in trying to create a new African identity, you allow China to donate a building for the African Union? So this is a sustenance of that kind of dependency syndrome. And I think this is the contradiction that Africans have been facing, both in the past but also now. Because of that whole tendency to think what is from outside is original, is superior. What is inside is inferior. Because this has been the socialization process. And this is what has made the kind of reinvention of identity a bit difficult. Because what we see come from outside looks more realistic than what we generate from inside. So this is a problem that needs to go away. The second point about decolonizing curriculum, yes, I think there's been, again, the example that was given, the attempt to kind of decolonize curriculum of universities, it didn't just start now. It started a long time ago, but there's still so much that needs to be decolonized. Like I mentioned before, if you do history, we were exposed to European history, you know, much more than African history. But today, African history is taught in many universities. But you'll be shocked to know that in Nigeria, for instance, the government twice now have removed history from the curriculum.
Why?
Because they think history is not contributing to the economy. So you could see that kind of myopic way of thinking, that history doesn't bring food to the table, so we can drop it from the curriculum. So there's a constant going forward and backward. And I think that, yes, also in Princeton, there's been an attempt. I think it's not just the students, but also faculty members. Let me give you one example. When I joined Princeton, for graduate students, you are expected to take 2 languages, to pass 2 languages, either Hebrew or Greek or Latin or...
The Theological Seminary?
Yeah. Yes, even the university, you take, or German or French, okay? Now, when I started having PhD students who research on Africa, I challenged my authority, the administration, that, look, I think the choice of languages should depend on the relevance of those languages to the students' research. And so I challenged them and I said, no, if I have African students who are going to do research in Africa, maybe in a context where Hausa is spoken, Hausa should be one of the languages required, not German and Greek. If it is Swahili, if a student is going to research in Kenya and Tanzania, Swahili is more relevant as a language for research and not Latin and French. So that deconstruction process is ongoing, and I succeeded in that. You know, one of my PhD students just passed the Hausa test, another just passed Kiswahili. You know, so this is part of the whole process of deconstruction, because it doesn't make sense to me for a student to do Hebrew and Latin, whereas all his work has to be in Africa. So what's the relevance? And it's happening in Africa as well. Yes, that students would prefer to take French and German instead of a local language. So it's a complex process. Yeah. Yes, I think this is a big challenge in the face of globalization. But essentially, I think one value that continues or that remains within African societies is the sense of community. You are not on your own. You are integral part of your community, and therefore questions of individualization, individualism, is difficult for a lot of people. Of course, if you look at the rural-urban dynamics today in the cities, people are becoming more and more individualized. But still, within the cities, the sense of community is still there. And that is why quite a lot of Africans get the shock of their lives when they go to Europe or America, and they discover how individualistic the society has become. But even in such contexts where they find themselves, this is where identity becomes important. People now suddenly see themselves as Africans and begin to organize religious communities, or hometown association or national association in a way of recreating cultural and national identities. So I would say that in spite of globalization, I think the sense of community is still very strong as a value within African societies. Yeah.
Sorry about the question. I was wondering what is the well, because there was the first wave of say European religions,
yes,
or northern religions, rather starting from the 16th century to some extent, and then 19th century. Yeah. But then there has been another wave. So Wahhabi Islam coming from Saudi Arabia, and Pentecostal, Mormon, sort of radical, evangelical Christianity coming from mainly from the U.S. What kind of impact did it have on this? You describe a somewhat sort of a tolerant, inclusive type of religious coexistence in Africa, whereas both those groups do not accept that at all. So find it abhorrent and do everything to fight against it.
Yes.
How does this work within Africa?
Yeah. No, thank you. I think this is part of the contradiction. I had a slide which I skipped, which says that indigenous traditions were very tolerant until the introduction of Christianity and Islam. And in actual fact, that generates religious competition that we have today. And of course, the problem has been that when you think about religious conflict that you find in different parts of Africa today, is the contradiction that was brought by Christianity and Islam. Because Christianity and Islam, to a large extent, introduced religious competition. The indigenous religion was very receptive, was very open and receptive, you know, to these two traditions. But because of religious competition, you know, it has produced a contradiction of that, and one of it is religious conflict. So the new traditions, whether in Islam or in Christianity, creates the new problems that we face today.
So,
yeah.
Boko Haram, for example.
Yes.
You suggested earlier that there's a strong sort of social element in this. This is not just religion. Surely, religious language is part of its arsenal. I mean, they're not just talking about being Western or Northern. Yeah. They're talking about fighting for Islam.
Yes.
They're killing for Islam, dying for Islam. How do the more established traditional groups view that type of new Islam or new Christianity?
Yeah, I think they are very critical about it. Also, I think, again, this is part of the whole religious competition. Let me take Nigeria, for instance.
Okay.
You find that it's misleading to say Muslims are in northern Nigeria and Christians are in southern Nigeria. It's much more complex. You have a lot of Muslims in southern Nigeria who live side by side with Christians, who celebrate festivals and everything together. You know, even in a family, the man can be Christian and the wife Muslim, and they don't have any contradiction. But you have this kind of, you know, much more extremist, you know, dimensions to religion that resists or gives an impression as if Christianity and Islam are incompatible. And this is what we find in the North because of what has been the kind of space contestation. The colonial system, you know, provide a legacy where they did not permit missionaries to go to the North. Christian missionaries were forbidden to go to the northern part of Nigeria.
Why?
Because the British had an indirect rule system and felt the best way to govern was to use, you know, the Muslim leadership. And so keeping Christians out of northern Nigeria became a situation in post-colonial time that the Muslims thought, okay, well, from time, we don't entertain Christians here. So Christians cannot, this is our zone. And what happened with the jihad, Uthman Danfodio jihad was to expand the caliphate, the Sokoto caliphate. And so this is the space contestation between Christianity and Islam now. Whereas the indigenous religion was receptive to both of them. But what happens in actual fact is that Christians and Muslims live together in Nigeria. But it's the politicization of religion that has led to a lot of the crises that we have. And I think it will be the same in Sudan, in Kenya, and some other parts of Africa.
We have to finish. Let me ask you just one last question.
Okay.
Are you optimistic?
I'm an optimist.
Yes.
Yes.
You are.
Yes. I believe very strongly.
Is this because you're a Christian, or?
No, I think it's because I'm a human being. Yes. Yes. I believe strongly that this kind of ascribed identity, we need to understand it, but we need to move forward with it. So I'm beginning to grapple with what it means to be an African, but also to change that ascribed identity, you know, which is an Africa or Africans that, you know, all we know about is disaster and war and crisis.
But do you feel African? Do you not feel Nigerian?
No, I do. I feel African when I'm outside. Yes. Right. When I'm in Nigeria, it would be stupid for me to say I'm an African. Yeah. So this is where identity comes. The African identity becomes important when you are outside. But when you are inside, it doesn't make sense. So this is where the construction, because the public sees you first as an African in many cases. Right. And then Africans also imbibe that construction, you know, because Africa in many eyes is like a village. Yes, where everybody knows everybody. So somebody meets me on the street and say, "Do you know James?" And I say, "James? Yeah, James is from Mozambique." I said, "No, I'm from Nigeria." I said, "Yeah, but I thought everybody in Africa knows everybody." Yeah. So this is the problem it creates. So I'm very optimistic about Africa, about Nigeria. Yes.
Good. I hope this is contagious.
Yes.
Because we need your optimism.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
One last word for all of you. In 2 weeks we're meeting at 2:30. Remember that. And we will remind you that, but because there is this conference, 2:30 instead of 2:15. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope I can.